Silence isn't empty, it's a battlefield. Every second without words is building tension, testing emotions, and revealing who truly values the connection more. Now, listen closely. Silence is rarely neutral. Most people assume that when two people stop talking, nothing is happening, that it's a simple pause, a momentary gap in conversation. But silence is not passive, it's loaded with emotional energy waiting to be released, analyzed, or reacted to. When two people are connected emotionally, romantically, or intimately, a pause in communication creates internal pressure. That pressure doesn't disappear just because no one is speaking, it accumulates. The brain hates unresolved signals, it craves information. And when information isn't available, the mind fills in the gaps with speculation and memory and emotional interpretation. This is why silence can feel louder than words. Every unanswered message, every delayed reply, every intentional pause carries meaning, even if it's unintentional. The human brain interprets absence as risk, loss, or rejection, and the emotional system responds accordingly. What you experience during silence isn't emptiness, it's emotional amplification. Every memory, every interaction, every emotional high and low you shared with that person starts replaying internally. The mind becomes hyper aware of the connection and what it means to lose it. Every moment of emotional intimacy, it becomes magnified because there's nothing present to balance it. Silence acts like a magnifying lens for attachment. And this is where most people get confused. They think silence is simply a lack of communication. But for the one who cares more, it's intense, it's pressure, it's discomfort, and the brain interprets that discomfort as a signal to act, to reach out, to break the silence. The energy that accumulates during quiet moments compels the mind and emotions to seek resolution. The longer the silence continues, the stronger that pull becomes. Every passing minute increases emotional tension, triggers reflection, and heightens awareness of the connection's significance. Silence also reveals the true dynamic of emotional investment. Words can mask feelings. Actions can hide attachment, but the way someone responds to quiet, whether they break first, remain patient, or resist the urge, exposes where their true emotional energy lies. The person who feels the pressure most acutely is usually the one who cares more because attachment amplifies the internal noise caused by absence. Meanwhile, the one with less emotional investment experiences the silence differently, often as neutral or even freeing because their nervous system isn't tied to the connection in the same way. That's why silence is one of the most powerful tools in relationships, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. It reflects emotional investment, exposes attachment, and shows who values the connection enough to feel its absence. And when someone starts feeling that pressure more than the other, it becomes clear who is truly at risk of breaking first. When two people are silent, the one who cares more feels it first. Emotional investment is like an invisible tether. You don't see it, but you feel its pull the moment tension rises. The more invested someone is, the faster the absence of interaction triggers internal discomfort. It's not about words, it's about the loss of connection, the pause in emotional feedback, the void where reassurance used to exist. Whoever has more at stake experiences silence not as peace, but as pressure. Emotional investment creates sensitivity. Every small signal, every imagined slight, every memory suddenly magnifies. The brain begins scanning for clues. Was my last message misinterpreted? Did I overstate? I say the wrong thing? These questions come not from insecurity alone, but from genuine attachment. When feelings are strong, absence becomes acute. It's not just missing conversation, it's missing emotional alignment, missing feedback that confirms connection, and missing validation that reinforces identity in relation to the other person. Meanwhile, the person who feels less doesn't experience the silence the same way. Their emotional equilibrium remains relatively intact. They might notice the pause, but it doesn't trigger the same level of urgency or reflection. Absence doesn't create internal tension for them because their attachment is weaker. They can observe without reacting, and their mind doesn't replay interactions to the same intensity. They aren't compelled to resolve the silence, it simply exists. This dynamic is why, in many silent standoffs, the one who cares more often breaks first. The pressure becomes unbearable. The mind seeks resolution not just for comfort, but because emotional investment drives action. It's a built in survival mechanism, the need to restore connection and stability when it feels threatened. This is why people often reach out first after days or even hours of silence, even if they consciously decided to maintain distance. Emotion overrides reason when attachment is high. It's also why silence can be so revealing. Words can be misleading, actions can be controlled. But emotional response to absence is raw. It exposes priorities, attachment levels, and subconscious desires. The one who initiates contact first is rarely the one with less feeling. They are the one who felt the void most acutely, whose emotional system demanded closure, and whose attachment could no longer tolerate continued tension. This is why understanding emotional investment is crucial. If you recognize who feels the pressure first, you can interpret behavior, correctly respond with awareness, and maintain emotional balance without reacting out of fear or impatience. Silence is not simply a pause in communication, it's a test of emotional strength, attachment, and priority. And when someone feels that discomfort more than the other, it usually reveals who values the connection most and who is like to act first. Ego plays a huge role when silence takes over in a relationship. Most people assume that who breaks first is determined solely by emotion or attachment, but pride and self image are often the real drivers. The ego doesn't want to appear needy, vulnerable, or desperate. It doesn't want to admit that the absence of the other person is affecting you more than you expected. And this is why silence can last longer than expected. It's not because the feelings aren't there, but because the mind and the ego are trying to maintain control. When someone cares deeply but refuses to reach out immediately, it's often a battle between the heart and the ego. Emotionally, they feel the pull, the discomfort, the desire to reconnect, but the ego intervenes and whispers, don't show weakness, don't let them see how much you feel, don't break first. And this internal conflict creates a delay in action. The longer the silence continues, the more the ego asserts itself. Pride becomes a mask for vulnerability, giving the appearance of calm detachment while internally emotional tension builds. This dynamic also explains why people sometimes act irrationally in silence. The mind knows the connection matters, but the ego resists exposure. The result is a mix of behaviors, hesitation, overthinking, and sometimes even contradictory impulses. One moment the desire to reconnect surges, the next the ego says, hold back, don't give in. The tension is invisible to the outside world, but internally it's intense. The person who seems unbothered may actually be struggling with a storm of conflicting emotions, all filtered through the lens of pride and self perception. Understanding this makes it clear that ego is both a protector and a barrier. It protects self image and maintains dignity, but it can also prevent emotional honesty. The longer the silence lasts, the more the ego entangles itself with attachment, creating a complex psychological dance. Sometimes the person who holds out longest is actually the one who cares most, because they are balancing the emotional weight of the relationship with the desire to protect their pride. Another subtle aspect is that ego driven silence can amplify desire. By resisting the impulse to reach out, the mind becomes hyper aware of what's missing. Thoughts replay past interactions, memories gain emotional weight, and the sense of loss grows. The ego tries to maintain control, but the emotional system keeps escalating the significance of the absence. This tug of war between emotion and pride intensifies the stakes and ultimately determines who breaks first. In this way, ego is a lens that shows not just who cares more, but who is also willing to risk emotional exposure. It creates hesitation, but it doesn't eliminate feeling. And often the person who reaches out first isn't less proud. They're simply the one whose emotional investment outweighs the protective barriers of the ego. So when silence stretches between two people, it's rarely a simple game of attention. It's a complex interplay of attachment, emotion, and ego, and understanding that is key to seeing who will act first. When silence fills the space between two people, the mind naturally begins to search for meaning. Humans are wired to avoid uncertainty, especially in relationships. When communication stops, curiosity takes over, and the brain starts filling in the blanks with speculation. Who will reach out first? Why haven't they contacted me? Are they okay? Are they thinking about me? These questions don't come from a lack of emotional control or immaturity, they come from attachment. Emotional investment drives curiosity, and curiosity fuels reflection. Curiosity replaces certainty because the mind dislikes gaps in understanding. Before silence, interactions provided constant feedback, a message, a call, a response that confirmed connection. Once that feedback stops, the brain is left with incomplete data. It starts generating possibilities, imagining scenarios, and predicting outcomes. Every imagined scenario triggers an emotional reaction: excitement, anxiety, hope, or even fear. The mind begins to evaluate not just what is happening externally, but what could be happening internally with the other person. And the more invested someone is, the more intense this process becomes. This is why emotional attachment often escalates during silent periods. The longer the silence, the more the mind searches and the more emotional energy is directed toward the absent person. The imagination becomes a private stage where memories, desires, and fears play out simultaneously. She might replay past conversations, imagine how you were spending your time, or wonder what you think of her absence. The brain treats these imagined interactions as real emotional experiences, reinforcing attachment without any actual contact. Curiosity also forces self reflection. When someone stops communicating, the mind starts asking, did I say something wrong? Did I push too hard? Did I misinterpret their feelings? These questions are uncomfortable because they force ownership of emotional dynamics. Curiosity doesn't just observe, it analyzes. It looks at patterns, past behaviors, and potential outcomes. The person who is more emotionally invested naturally engages in this analysis first because their need for understanding is greater. Another subtle aspect of curiosity is how it amplifies desire. The unknown is always more compelling than the known. When someone disappears, their absence creates a void that the mind cannot ignore. Every detail about them becomes significant. A change in tone, a fleeting memory, a hint of presence online. The uncertainty fuels attraction, and the imagination intensifies longing. Curiosity bridges the gap between absence and emotional engagement, making the silent period emotionally charged rather than empty. Finally, curiosity is what makes the first move so revealing. The person who breaks silence first is often the one whose mind and emotions were most affected. They've processed, imagined, and reflected more intensely than the other person. Their curiosity, born from attachment, compels action, and while ego may still influence timing, emotional need eventually pushes them to close the gap and seek clarity. When silence stretches on, curiosity becomes the engine of emotional awareness, showing who truly feels the absence, who thinks about the connection, and who is most likely to act first. When silence stretches between two people, the subconscious begins to demand resolution. Even if neither person speaks, the mind feels incomplete, unsettled, and compelled to seek closure. Unfinished emotional stories create tension, and tension builds until it demands release. The human brain is designed to reduce uncertainty, and relationships are no exception. When communication stops, the mind interprets it as a problem to be solved, an emotional puzzle that must be addressed. The longer the silence lasts, the more the mind turns inward, replaying memories, interpreting actions, and imagining possible scenarios. Every interaction that once occurred now gains exaggerated significance. Every word, every laugh, every shared moment is recalled with heightened clarity. The subconscious takes these fragments and reconstructs them into a narrative, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what could have been different. This process is not always conscious, but it shapes feelings, thoughts, and eventually behavior. The need for emotional resolution is relentless because unresolved attachment feels like an open wound. Even if she appears calm externally, internally, the mind is running through loops. She may imagine reaching out but hesitate, think about what to say, or create mental conversations that will never occur. Each imagined scenario reinforces emotional attachment and intensifies longing. The subconscious cannot distinguish between imagined connection and actual connection. It reacts as though the contact is real. Over time, the tension created by this internal activity becomes so strong that it drives action. Someone breaks silence not because they suddenly feel something new, but because the unresolved emotional pressure becomes unbearable. This need for emotional resolution is heightened when the connection was meaningful and authentic. The deeper the investment, the more significant the tension. When there is a strong emotional bond, the silence creates a psychological vacuum, and the mind cannot tolerate emptiness. Every day of no contact amplifies the perceived value of the other person. The mind interprets absence as scarcity, and scarcity triggers both longing and urgency. The subconscious wants to restore balance, to close the emotional gap, and to relieve the internal stress caused by unfulfilled attachment. Interestingly, the drive for resolution often comes before conscious desire. People may act without fully realizing why. The first message sent, the first attempt at reconnection, or even subtle gestures are guided by the subconscious need to complete the unfinished emotional story. Ego, pride, and logic may delay action, but they cannot override the pressure built by sustained attachment. The one who breaks first is almost always the person whose emotional system has experienced the greatest tension during the silence. Silence is more than just a pause in communication, it is a test of emotional investment, self control, And attachment, the subconscious demand for reveals who is most connected, who feels the absence most acutely, and who is most likely to act to restore equilibrium. And when that pressure reaches its peak, action becomes inevitable. The person who has moved on doesn't feel the same pressure silence creates. Absence only hurts when attachment still exists. When emotional investment fades, the quiet doesn't trigger tension, curiosity, or longing, it simply exists. Someone who is detached emotionally experiences the silence differently. It doesn't magnify feelings or provoke anxiety. Their mind isn't looping through memories. Their ego isn't struggling to protect itself. And their heart isn't pulled by unmet needs. They may notice the gap, but it doesn't disrupt their emotional equilibrium. For the person who is still attached, however, absence is a constant presence. Every unspoken moment, every lack of contact becomes an amplifier of desire and reflection. The emotional system is activated precisely because the connection still matters. When someone no longer values the interaction, their nervous system remains calm, detached, and unaffected. This is why, in any silent standoff, the person who truly cares feels the weight first and is more likely to break. Detachment creates immunity to emotional tension, and that immunity is what separates the one who moves on from the one who struggles. Emotional investment is always visible in the way silence is experienced. The more someone values the connection, the more their mind amplifies absence. Thoughts become loops, memories play, and imagination fills the gaps. Desire and longing intensify. Subtle cues, a social media update, a mutual friend story, or even a memory triggered by a place or song create heightened awareness. For the emotionally detached person, these same cues pass unnoticed. They no longer carry emotional weight. Their silence is neutral, while the attached person feels each passing moment as significant. This difference explains why the first move almost always comes from the one still invested. Emotional need drives action, curiosity, longing, and attachment push someone to act because their subconscious wants resolution, contact, and reassurance. Ego may delay action, but it cannot eliminate the internal pressure created by continued investment. Meanwhile, the detached individual does not feel the same urgency. They are free from the emotional pull that silence generates, which is why they rarely reach out first. Another key aspect is perspective. The person who has moved on sees the silence as ordinary, perhaps even healthy, while the invested person interprets it as meaningful. Every minute without contact is a psychological event for them. The mind assigns significance, weighs consequences, and projects outcomes. The more attached someone is, the more the silence transforms into emotional weight. Meanwhile, the person who is detached observes without being affected. Absence has no emotional consequence for them, only for the one who still cares. Ultimately, the psychology of who breaks first hinges on emotional attachment. Silence reveals who feels the void, who values the connection, who experiences internal tension versus calm neutrality. Detachment neutralizes absence, while attachment amplifies it, and that is why the one who has truly moved on never breaks.